Up until 1973, the General Conference, of course, had records, but they were not systematically kept. There was no records management program. And we know from memoranda of the time that that was increasingly a concern, that if the church wanted to know how had it dealt with a certain sort of problem that had arisen in the past, where did you find the necessary documents? They might be scattered all around different departments. There would be some in Secretariat, some in this department, some in that department, and who knew what had happened to others. So in May 1971, the General Conference officers, for the first time that we can find, state in passing, the whole subject of General Conference archives and archivists is now under study. And in that autumn of 1971, in September, the General Conference Archives received a recommendation from the Special Items Committee that the General Conference Committee give favorable consideration to the employment of an archivist at headquarters to organize and care for church historical documents in possession of the General Conference. And having received this report from the Special Items Committee, the General Conference Officers Committee referred it back to the Special Items Committee to give further study. Some of us recognize this as a very common practice here at the General Conference. And in January 1973, the Special Items Committee, having given further study, gave a further report. So that's over 12 months later, but it finally reported back to the General Conference officers with the recommendation to create another committee. And so an ad hoc archives and archivist committee was created, chaired by Willis J. Hackett, a General Conference Vice President. And then it's then in the spring of 73 that things, the winter and spring of 73, that things start to pick up. Partly, I think, and the matter is, as I've discussed, had actually been under study since the spring of 1971. But I think some impetus was probably given by the fact that in December 1972, Arthur White had met with Adventist historians who were meeting at the annual conference of the American Historical Association in New Orleans, and they pleaded for access for scholars to the records, historical records of the GC, which at that time would not be made available to researchers. And it's interesting, actually, that if one looks at some of the early really good critical scholarship on Adventist history, I'm thinking of things published in the mid to late 70s, including an excellent essay on the church from roughly the 1870s to 1901 by Richard Schwartz. It cites, for its manuscript sources, it cites a number of letters in the archives of the Review and Herald, the letter books of the Review and Herald Publishing Association, and nothing from the General Conference. And I think that's because he'd probably done his research before the archive was founded, or perhaps it had not yet been fully organized. So at that stage, if researchers wanted to use original correspondence, they had to go to the White Estate, or indeed to the Review and Herald, but they had no access to the General Conference. So December 1972, Adventist historians say to Arthur White, the secretary, or as we'd now say, the director of the L&G White Estate, can we have access to this? And so Arthur White passed that on to the GC officers, and I will engage in a little bit of historical revisionism here. There is a little bit of a myth that says that was the key in setting up the GC archives, but actually, as I say, it was already under discussion from May 1971. So I would say I think there's probably, first is the recognition of GC administrators that there is a problem, and then the fact that Arthur White, the immensely respected head of the L&G White Estate and grandson of Ellen White, says we should do something that can give our historians access to these records. I think those two things come together. And so sometime in the spring, Willis Hackett visited Donald Yost, who he had known, I think you said earlier, since you were a boy, and suggested to him that perhaps instead of being editor of Insight magazine or a book editor at the Review and Herald, being the first General Conference archivist might be something he'd like to consider. And the rest, as they say, is history. In April 1973, the General Conference Committee, Executive Committee, at its spring meeting, voted to create a position of an archivist with a secretary, and then passed other details on to the General Conference officers. On May 30, they took the decision to recommend to the Personnel Committee that Don Yost of the Review and Herald be invited to serve as General Conference Archivist, requesting that satisfactory understanding be entered into with the Review and Herald concerning their investment in his educational program that they had contributed to your PhD. And it took a few days for the Personnel Committee to process this and for an arrangement to be reached with the Review and Herald, but on June 6, Willis Hackett called Don Yost and said, yes, I'm not sounding you out now, I'm offering you the job. And fortunately, Dr. Yost accepted, and he started in the position on July 1st. So if we're commemorating a 40th anniversary, we could take it from April 3, when the General Conference Committee voted to create the position of archivist, from May 30, when the General Conference officers said, well, Yost is the man, July 1st or June 6, and for various reasons we've decided to go with the June 6 date because it was the most convenient for holding this date. But it is the 40th anniversary of Don Yost being offered the job, and so we're delighted to have him here with us. I said this earlier, but I've said it actually to many people in person to person. Everything we do still in the Record Center and Archive here is founded on what Don Yost created. The first session is going to be a sort of more hands-on approach. We're going to hear from Don Yost about how he created the Record Center, and then also from Peter Chiomenti, who is the Assistant Director for Archives and Records Management and has worked here since 1991. Is the longest serving member of this department and is in charge of the Records Center, and he will talk about a reflection. So we'll have the first two papers, as it were, on the practice of the General Conference Archives and Records Center, and you'll see on your program it's entitled Founding and Managing the GC Archives and Records Center. Then after a break, two papers on philosophical and methodological approaches to Adventist history. The third session will be a round table, a panel discussion on writing Black SDA history sources and methodologies, and we're very pleased to have several distinguished historians of Black Seventh-day Adventism with us. And then the final session will be two papers with presenting quite different perspectives on what is now, of course, a global history. So that's our plan for the afternoon. Thank you again. Thank you very much for being with us. And we will now move into the colloquium proper. So, Don and Peter, if you care to join me. So in a sense, after what I've just said, the speaker needs no introduction, but just to confirm, our first speaker is Dr. F. Donald Yost, General Conference Archivist Emeritus, who has had a long career serving the church, had been an academy and college teacher before he went to the Review and Herald as editor of Insight magazine, the founding editor of Insight magazine, a book editor at the Review and Herald, archivist of the General Conference, and then from 1975, director of the Office of Archives and Statistics. Don.
I'm hoping that my presentation will be an interactive one with questions and comments. I don't know how many of you have used archival materials, but I'm going to start out by sharing with you, if you were not present for the luncheon, the principles of archival administration. First of all, there is should be always a sharp distinction between library science and archival administration. There are archival collections in libraries, and I presume there are libraries in archives, as you see on your left. But the matter of classification is totally different. What is the classification system for classifying published material? Can anybody tell me? What is the classification system for classifying published material, like books?
Library of Congress.
Well, what's the system? What do they look at when they open a book to have it cataloged? What do they ask themselves?
Subject.
What is the subject, right? That is all they're concerned about. What is the subject? They want to know the author, the publisher, of course. A library is based upon the classification system. It can be any, you can make up your own system of subject matter. There's the Dewey Decimal System, the Library of Congress system, and so on. Don't ever try to classify unpublished materials for permanent use by subject. That has been done, and the literature of archival administration has tears running down the pages where individuals tried to pull apart groups of materials, of records, and classify unpublished material by subject. And of course, once having done that, it could never be put back together again like Humpty Dumpty on the wall. So what is left for a person who is taking a gathering of materials, as I did? Were most of you in the dining room where we had our meal at noon? Uh-huh. Well, if you know that room, and perhaps, I guess this room would be a fair comparison. The first vault, and there were 4 vaults. I'll just stop and think. I can think of 3 for sure.
I think there were 4.
There are 4? Yeah. There were 4 vaults, the other one's smaller, but the first one that I went to was where the basic historical records, going all the way back to 1863, were housed, and it was called the Secretariat Vault, or Presidential. The two officer groups had their materials in that room, and I would say it was about the size of this room, and there were shelves all the way around, wooden shelves, and many of the containers were these long drawer cardboard files. Some were boxes, some were wrapped in paper and string, but I wish I could tell you how many cubic feet of records there were in that vault when we walked in the door. But what principle then, since an archivist is not dealing with published material, what does he use as the basic principle for the classification of the material? You aren't archivists, are you?
Is it date?
Yeah, date or author.
Yeah.
Author comes close to it. Date, of course, is a permanent
Creator.
factor.
Creator.
Yes. The name of the principle is provenance, a French word. Do you know that word? I didn't know it. Fountain, what is the source? Where did this come from? So this is the principle, the first principle of archival administration. Now, in order for me, when I came here to begin my work, let me back up just a little bit. When Elder Hackett approached me in the spring of '73, and I listened to what he said, which was very brief. He didn't say, this is what an archivist is. He said, do you want to be an archivist? And I had to say to myself, well, I don't know whether I want to be one or not. And as you heard in my presentation at the luncheon, I scurried over to the University of Maryland Library, and to this day I can't remember how I had permission to go in the stacks, but I did. I somehow, maybe it was through interlibrary loan or something, however that works. But I found on the shelves 2 or 3 books on archival administration, read them with delight, and went back to Elder Hackett and said, yes, I will do that. But in the process of this, I realized that I needed to know something about this organization called the General Conference. What was the map of the General Conference in the years following 1863? And then what happened in 1901 when the church was reorganized, the whole concept of church organization changed. And I was fortunate to find that the church had, the Review and Herald, had just very recently published the first edition of the Seventh-day Adventist Encyclopedia. And in that encyclopedia were descriptions of all of the different agencies that the General Conference had between 1863 and 1901, and how the change occurred and so on. So I had then an outline, a picture. I had the dates when every one of these units was organized, and I proceeded to establish what an archivist calls a record group. Now, let me just take a department. Let's take the Sabbath School department, for example. There had been a Seventh-day Adventist, I'm not sure this is the exact title now, there had been a Seventh-day Adventist Sabbath School Association prior to 1901. But then it became a department of the General Conference at the reorganization. Well, that wasn't the same organization, even though it had somewhat the same name. So I assigned a record group number to the pre-1901 organization and a different record group number to the one after that. And I could go on in a great deal of detail. But knowing every division, every department, every agency of the General Conference, from the time it was founded until I started my work, gave me the framework. And from the outline that I developed, the provenance, the source, was established. And I knew then, when I came across something in this big room, I knew exactly where to plug it into my classification system. When I took it out of the box, I was defining it. First thing I would take out, open a folder, see who wrote it, what the date was, see what the file folder said, if there was a file folder, and so on. That's defining the material. And then I knew how to classify it. I want to give a special word of credit to the person who was called my secretary at the time, but in actuality filled the function of assistant archivist. Her name was Barbara Forker, Forquer. She's still living. She lives in Matthews, North Carolina, a suburb of Charlotte. And I've talked to her recently, and she would have loved to be here, but she couldn't come. So that was what she and I did together. I'll never forget the day. Well, let me just quickly say that in time, after I had done some preliminary work for the White Estate and done some traveling, and had taken a course in archival administration at Ohio State University, came back here to Tacoma Park, and was ready to start my work. By that time, or shortly afterwards, when I had everything set up philosophically, I went to the office of Elder Franz, who by this time had been given the responsibility of supervising my work because he was the secretary of the General Conference. And by the way, he just celebrated his 100th birthday. And I was pleased to be there. But I went into his office. I said, "Now, Elder Franz, I'm ready to begin my work." I don't know whether this was in August or September, when it was. He pulled open the drawer of his desk, reached in, took out a key, and said, "Here's the key to the vault. Go to it." This encyclopedia that I referred to, I think, was issued in 1966. And as I said before, if I hadn't had that, I don't know what I would have done. Do you have any questions so far? I think the only other thing that I can mention is the way in which we proceeded. First of all, I think I'm correct in saying that, let's see now. In 1973, there was a substantial use of mainframe computers with non-random access capacity, with these large reels of tape that would dance back and forth, finding where the field was that it was looking for. Hollerith cards that you punched, 80-column cards. We did not go in that direction. with our inventory of the records. We use 4x6 cards. You ever hear of 4x6 cards? So Barbara had the cards, and she and I would take a box off of the shelf and open it and see what was inside. If I make a mistake in my description and you know what's correct, don't hesitate to correct me, because it's been a little while since I've thought about some of these things. But this collection of shelving would be called a range, wouldn't it? And this is a stack, and this is a shelf from here to here, okay? So when we found out what it was that was here on the shelf, we labeled it. We wanted to know the location for later. Of course, we didn't want to lose it right away. And so this range would be range A, and the one across here would be range B, and on around the room and in the middle of the room. And all of the ranges were given a letter or a number, and then the stack. So there would be range A, stack 1, stack 2, stack 3, and then the shelf. So each one had an address. And I don't know that we were concerned about the fact that there were 3 boxes on the shelf, whether we just left that so that because we could see that when we got there. So on the card it said what the record group was in language, in English words, and in the record group number, of course. And I haven't mentioned another step that we take, which I will in just a minute. And of course, then we put down the address. And like lots of other things, if you make a mistake in recording the address of something, it's lost. Who knows? And look at, here I am with 1,000 cubic feet of records in the room, or 2,000, and I make a mistake in locating it. How am I ever going to find it again? We tried not to think of that. The second part of our work at that time was to establish standard record series. A record group is all of the records that originate in a given department or unit of the organization. A record series is all the records of a similar characteristic. Correspondence is a record series. Committee minutes is a separate record series. Financial statements is a record series. Papers, documents of research documents or whatever, and there'd be a separate series. And so I developed a standard list of series. It could be anything. I don't know whether you're still following the same list or not, but anyway, it has to be standardized. So as the years pass and you go from one organization or one unit in the building or in the organization to another, the record series that you have named a certain thing is the same across the board, everywhere you do it. Compared to library work, I will have to tell you, and we might as well demystify archival administration and also remove the halo that you folks have tried to put on me today. Compared to library science, archival administration is simple in terms of definition and classification. Now, there are other parts to it that are not so simple. And one of those is getting the cooperation of those who originate the records and don't want to give them up, or have thrown them away, or in some other way are not cooperating with you in what they taught you at Ohio State University when you took the course, or wherever. So the whole thing was a lot of fun because I love detail, I love classification. I even designed my own library classification system based loosely on Dewey or the Library of Congress. So it's a hobby with me. And so I was just doing what I liked. And I treasured every moment of those years that I spent working here, and am thrilled beyond measure with the work that Dr. David Trim is doing now, and Peter. And Peter's the only one on the staff now, by the way, who was here when I said goodbye in 1995.
Well, I'm Peter, the one that's left. And this is what you get. I want to start out and by saying thank you to Elder Yost. I love his system that he set up, and we'll touch on some of the things that he mentioned earlier. It's very much like Old Home Week, listening to what he went through and how we started out. But first I want to share a very sort of personal reflection that involves the archives, sort of tangentially, but I think is interesting. Was interesting to me when I thought of it. And I might add that one time, I don't know, I guess I was taking a test. I was working on my master's degree, and I finished it, and the comment that my professor made was, "Oh, I just never thought of it that way before." So if something comes to you from me from left field, I've done that before. So anyway, I remember when I was about 11 or 12, I lived in Tacoma Park, and I walked to the library and wanted to check out a book, and of course they made me get a library card. And on the library card, it was good for 3 or 4 years. I forget what it was. It was somewhere in the area of 1960, and it went until 64 or 65. I forget what exactly. And I remember walking home, looking at my new library card and thinking, how strange this is. It seems kind of foolish to give me a card that's going to be good that long into the future. I'm sure we'll all be in heaven by then. And here I stand before you, 65 years old, and we're not gone. So I was thinking about that, and I thought to myself, you know, that's kind of a disappointment to us. And I was thinking, you know, the archives is a way of our dealing with our disappointment. Our disappointment was not necessarily as great or as profound or as sudden as the disappointment of the believers in 1844, but it's a disappointment nonetheless. And if we can look at our past and see how the Lord has led us in the past, we can know that we're on the right track and take courage. As I mentioned, I'm 65, and they tell me as you get older, you may start to approach a second childhood. And I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I'm about to engage in a little bit of show and tell. So if you want to go back toward first grade and enjoy a little bit of show and tell, but I want to deal with some of the technology that we've had since the archives started. Not all the technology that we have collected in the archives, and I might add this is a small departure because we're not really a museum, we're an archives, but we do have some artifacts. First of all, because an archives is for data storage and retrieval and dispensation or distribution of the information, this is what Dr. Yost was just mentioning. The data was stored on these, and this is a mainframe tape, and they would mount these, and it would zip back and forth. And a lot of the yearbook material was, at the time the archives was founded, was stored on this type of medium. Then this is just a personal fascination. I have no idea how much information was actually stored on this. This is about twice the size of most computers nowadays.
That's a floppy disk.
And this is a floppy disk. It's a much larger than than I've ever used. And
While he's picking up the next item, one of our distinguished denominational educators had prepared his commencement address, a commencement address, and he took the floppy disk and kind of balled it up a little bit and stuck it in his pocket to give it to the ISS person where he was going. That was the end of that floppy disk.
as you can see, they got much smaller, held a little bit more material. And when I first came, this is what I was using on my computer. So I was very excited when we got these, which held just a little bit over a megabyte. And nowadays, most pictures that you take with your camera won't fit on this. Finally, as the work matured, we went to discs. First, the CD, which was huge, and then DVD, which was even bigger. And we were mixing them with these, which are, I'm sure everybody remembers these, and now nobody uses these. And then, of course, microfilm, which we still have a great deal of, and still use, although to a lesser extent. And finally, I know you know, everybody knows, everybody has one of these. But this is actually also a mass storage device for information. Now, I'm not quite done, because the storage devices that was only part of the archives. You also have to communicate. So when I came, we were still using these, and this one is actually still in use here. This is a regular, good old brown phone. And then I thought I was being very advanced, and believe it or not, this is still mine, but I don't use it anymore. This is, believe it or not, a mobile phone. And you can dial up and talk to people almost like you were on your regular phone. Here's your antenna. Of course, the battery has long since ceased to exist. Yes, it was bulky, but the things you do just to be kind of cool. And actually, I used it one time when my car broke down. Got to tow people, so it's actually been quite helpful. And then, to be even more cool, got this nice little flip phone, which is 2 generations ago of phones that I've owned. And it took pictures, you could text with it, but it was mostly a phone. And then back to this. Which does just about everything except the dishes. We'll get back to this in a little bit, but this will be one of the challenges facing archives in the future. A tremendous amount of information can be stored on this, can be gathered with this, can walk in and out with this. It's just something to keep in mind. I will look at the archives as it's gone from basically from when I came to the present. I've divided the time in 3 sections. I have the establishment, and then growth, and then finally outreach. They are not divided into specific years, although I've divided them sort of by directors of the archives. And as you can see, I had that sort of section with the technology to show as it matured. So just to move on, and then finally, I guess what I'll do is I'll mention a challenge, and I'll have a brief illustration that I'd like you to keep in mind from the challenges for the archives. As Elder Yost mentioned, he established the record groups. They're the same record groups that we're using now. We've added one or two, but we followed his plan very closely. It's a very excellent plan, and it's made life much, much better for us. And so we thank you for that. I'm amazed at it. Elder Yost also didn't mention this, but he established a good and active retention schedule for the entire organization. That is more of a records management thing than an archives thing, but it also affects the archives. If you have no retention schedule, which is a condition that we're sliding toward, then you'll get more information into the archives than you want. And I know that sounds kind of crazy. How can you get more information than you want? But it just means that you have more to dig through before you get to something that's relevant. As he also mentioned, they started out with cards, and so Elder Yost, during his time, moved from a card indexing system for the management of the archives into the PC era of indexing. That it seems sort of the early PCs, and I might add that my first PC, when I started with that floppy disk, had a gigantic hard drive of 32 megabytes, which is not even a good RAM these days. But it was quite a jump. We didn't have a network, so the archive side had its own database, and the records management side had its own database, and we're now bringing those together. As I also mentioned, the yearbook was still on the mainframe, so we were dealing with paper PCs, a variety of databases at a mainframe, and we were managing to try and juggle all of that. Also, under Elder Yost, he brought in Sylvia Itcherberg to help him with the statistics as the management of the archives grew to managing archives and yearbook and statistics. He brought in Mrs. Itcherberg to help out, and she was one of the first employees in the department to be a full-time employee with statistics. Now, Elder Yost might not remember it. It was a funny incident. I had an assistant at that time, and she was very tired. It was during lunch. And so we had the same sort of tall cubicles. It was a little different arrangement. And she decided that she could use a little nap. So she crawled underneath the table and slept. In the meantime, Elder Yost needed to fill out some forms. And this was back when we still had a computer or a typewriter around. And so he came and pulled in just about where she was, sat at the typewriter, filled out his form, and she woke up actually and wondered what she was going to do, and decided that she would just breathed very shallowly and be quiet and hoped that he finished before he discovered her. I don't know if you ever knew, anyway.
I don't remember that.
That's okay. She'd be pleased that you don't remember it. After Elder Yost left, the next director was Bill Cash, and I still keep him in the establishment part of the archive. The archive had existed for over 20 years, but as Elder Yost mentioned, and I was glad to hear him mention it, one of the issues facing the archives was getting people to trust you with their records. In other words, if I send you a box full of files and I want one of them back, can I get that back? And when can I get it back? And I remember when I came, things seemed established to me. And somebody wasn't cooperating, and I remember mentioning to Elder Yost, well, why can't you just tell them, you just have to do this? And he said, no, we need to, just go slow, slow me down. We just need to increase their confidence level in what we do, and then they'll send us boxes. If you didn't notice it on the way in, you'll notice it on the way out. Their confidence level has gone way up, and we've got boxes all over the place. When Dr. Cash came, he was the same age I am, and I found out when I invited him to go to a conference that I wanted to go to, and I wanted him to understand what I was dealing with in records management. He did go, but he said it caused him a few little problems at home since it was on his birthday, which was October 22, which I teased him about a little bit later. During that time, Evelyn Osborne retired, and the yearbook went from mainframe to PC. And Wesleyan Solly was here for that transition. And my recollection of Dr. Cash was that he traveled a great deal, and talked to Wesleyan later and confirmed that it was a time of many interesting tribulations for her, trying to go from the mainframe to the PC. She was just desperately trying to learn, but she did a very good job. Came in, and at the time she left, she said that she woke up every morning looking forward to coming into work because she enjoyed her work. So, when I did mention it to her, she said, "Oh, I didn't know that anybody noticed." But during this time, and this is one reason why I included this in the establishment part, things were starting to change a great deal. At the time, the president of the General Conference was Elder Falkenberg. He was a very enthusiastic person for technology, and it wasn't that Elder Yost wasn't enthusiastic for technology. He was on the ISS board, and he was very forward-thinking. It's just technology was just starting to take off. And as you all know, we started down the road toward document management, and let me just backtrack for a second. The first week that I was here at work, I went with Jim Ford, whose place I was taking, and Elder Yost, and we went to a demonstration of document management software. So we were always interested in that field, even though we hadn't gotten there. But as you know, that Elder Falkenberg left rather suddenly. Also at that time, the head of ISS took a call to Andrews, and then Dr. Cash, for personal reasons, ended his tenure here. as director. So all of those things combined really stopped our movement toward document management. And the thought was, okay, let's just consolidate, let's go slow, let's start again and take care of our records in a more traditional way. So during that time, after that, when Bert Holoviak took over, we did that. That suited Bert very well. He was very interested in research, and he wasn't as enthusiastic for outreach. But that's not to say that he didn't do things that didn't further the church. One of the most significant contributions that he made was starting our website, and he was very involved in it. It didn't just take place while he was the director. It took place, and he participated in it while he was the director. So he was very involved in it, and he was very excited about it, really. My office got moved into a closet, and I'm right next to the director's office. And I could hear sometimes if the conversation got really animated, I could hear parts of the conversation from where I was. And I could hear Bert sometimes in there talking to people about the website, demonstrating it for them. He was just very excited about it. And during his time, there were over 1 million pages of material added for research that were outward-facing and that people could research. At the last GC session, just before he retired, we managed to get a booth at the GC session and promoted the website. He was very enthusiastic about it. And the website that he put up is really the backbone of the website that we have now. Our website is built on the work that he did. Also, in terms of computer use and so forth, he hired an IT person for the department. The first person that he hired was Jonathan Brower. And then after Jonathan left, we have Joshua Marco over here behind the camera. One of the things that Jonathan did was to write a database for the yearbook and for the annual statistical report, so that it made putting that material together much more easy and easy to track. And it also made it easier to put up on the website. So that was another big contribution. I remember sitting in a small conference with him, and he was saying, what project do we need to do now, possibly, for the website? And I said, we have glass slides, and we do. And I said, that would be a good project for an intern. And I had never seen him that animated. He really thought that was a great idea. And so that summer, an intern came in and digitized a lot of our glass slides. And Bert spent a lot of time that he was just in his office and you wouldn't be able to see what he was doing, writing up captions and identifying the various photos on those slides. And finally, we had the opportunity, because of work that we had done with an audio digitizing group, and because we had the knowledge and resources for it, we got a grant from Loma Linda through Michael Campbell, and we digitized the 1952 Bible Conference. So we have that complete set on DVDs now. We had it on reel-to-reel. The tape was starting to decay. In fact, some of it did smell a little bit like vinegar, so it was really on its way out. And shortly after GC session, Bert Holoviak retired and Dr. Trim took over. And I remember when Bert told us who was going to be the director, I was kind of excited because I said, I remember him. I remember him. And I went into my office, opened a drawer, pulled out his card from a time that he had visited. And when he says he remembers how small the research area was, he remembers it because he was in here doing research for several days, and we had some interesting conversations. Since Dr. Trim has come, he's been involved. He's had a lot of energy. He's been involved in a lot of other areas of the organization, strategic planning, some outreach programs. And so I call this the time of outreach. Now Archives has established itself. It's established within the organization, and it had become time for us now to be not just a place, a repository, but to be an active part of the organization. We do all the things still that an archives does, but now we have become more active in the missionary planning and the missionary outreach. One of the things that we have done is that the Secretariat and what was TRIPS, it's called IPRS now. Don't ask me, I can't remember. Have combined their files for active missionaries or IDEs, and we digitized them starting in November, and they're all now digital. We're finishing up on the historic missionary records, so that we will by the end of summer have all of the missionary records, historic and current, digitally available within the building. Obviously, these things don't go out to the general public on the website, so please don't walk out of here and say, oh, do you know what they're doing? Look for your record on the website. It won't be there. And now we're also thinking of a digital library or digital archive, and combining our efforts with the White Estate and with Andrews and some of the other areas, so that we would at least be able to cross-reference material that each has and that we can share digitally. Finally, the challenge, digital has become a great challenge to archives, not only ours, but all over. And I have sort of two models running around in my head, and I'm going to share them. Maybe they'll run around in yours. One is called a stream model of information, and the people generate the information, and it flows down the stream. Different people gather it and use it as need be, and in the end, what's sort of left over, or what has gone through, ends up down at the end with kind of a pond that you might call the archives. And that fit the paper situation well. That's sort of how it worked. You know, you created it, it was in your office for a while, then it maybe went to the record center and was shared a little bit with relevant people, and then finally ends up in the archives. The other model that seems to fit the digital mold better would be what I call the pond model. Things are created digitally, and they're immediately available. They are not tied geographically to anything. Before, if you put something on a piece of paper, it's on the paper, your information is only here. It's part of geography as well as part of information. So wherever this paper goes, the information goes, and if you want it, you have to go where the paper is, or have the paper sent to you. In the digital age, the information is out there. Everybody has a shot at it. It's in terms of, it's sort of like, it's only permission. So I call it a pond because all the information is in there, and whoever needs it can use it whenever, as soon as it's created, and they have access to it. And brings the archive from down at the end all the way up to the beginning on in the process of discussing what to do with the records as they're created, and who gets them, and when they get them, and how they get them. And that's where my phone comes in, or your phone, or anybody's phone. We also have to be careful that the information doesn't just stay on the phone, doesn't just stay on the laptop, doesn't just go from here to someplace where it shouldn't be, or doesn't get produced by this and never get back to the people that need it for future generations. It's a challenge. I don't have all the answers, I just have the questions, and maybe in time some of you can have some of the answers. Thank you very much.
All right, we have a good amount of time for comments and questions. While you're gathering your thoughts, I just want to highlight what I think that Don Yost's intellectual mapping of the Adventist history in creating the record group system was a remarkable achievement. And one thing he said, well, several things stood out, but one in particular, he said how he and Barbara went in and he said, when we found out what was there. And that was literally the state where things are at. The GC had vaults, but things just kept being put into the vaults, and there was no real sense. There was a vague sense of what there was, but not necessarily of where it might be in those vaults. And a number of historians are in the room, and I think you would agree with me that it's not enough for documents to survive if they're not well managed and accessible. It's almost as bad as them not surviving. And one only has to think of the best example of this being the history of the Ottoman Empire. As it turns out, quite a lot of their records have survived, but until recently they were in such a chaotic state that people could not use the documents to write Ottoman history. In the last 20 years, as the archives increasingly are organized, the history of what was one of the great powers of the world has been almost transformed because people were able to access the documents. So long as they're there, there's always the hope of them being organized, but if they're not, then it's almost as bad as them not existing at all. So that was to organize them, but also to create the record group system, which basically was an intellectual mapping of the church's whole organizational administrative history, was a remarkable achievement. And one thing that I would like to underscore from Peter's presentation, Bert Holoviak's heroic, not to say Herculean, efforts to create the website, which now has over 1.6 million pages of content, is something that every Adventist historian, and not just historian, is deeply, deeply indebted to him for. And to Jonathan Brower and to Joshua, who some of you can't see because he's manning the camera. You can see his disembodied hand just waving there. Who continue to upgrade the online archive. It's a remarkable achievement. So those are just a couple of points that I would like to underscore. Any questions or comments? Ben?
Well, your point about records that are unorganized hardly need to exist. And I've been thinking and wondering, before 1973, and you begin to get them organized, was there any significant use being made of church archives? And if so, how were people accessing them and finding things?
You mean here at the General Conference?
Yes.
There was no access, except the way in which that first vault that was used by the Secretariat and presidential offices worked was that every year, as the secretaries set up their new filing system for the following year and removed the one from 3 years back or 4 years back from the back of the drawer or whatever, they, the women, if I may use that term, the secretaries, the office secretaries, had a key, access to the key, and they would go down and they would make room and push in the new records. I mean, it wasn't, not quite that way, but it happened, unfortunately. I don't know what damage was done, but just a few years before I began, one of the former associate secretaries of the General Conference was brought out of retirement to go into that vault and to cull and to make more room in there. I don't know what he threw away, but we hope that it was I hope it was all the cullable material, and it may very well have been. But the only the only access to that vault was through the secretary of the General Conference or the president, depending on which records you wanted. And the only people who went in there were usually doing one of two things. They were adding new material, or they were retrieving a particular file that they knew was there from very recent years. So there was internal administrative use. The same was true of the Treasury Vault, which was nearby. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and one follow-up, because I recall that Richard Schwartz begins research for light bearers in 73, 74. And did he have occasion then to make use of archives in writing that work?
Beautiful question. I'll tell you why. Dick Schwartz and I lived in the same hall in the dormitory at Emmanuel Missionary College. Went to school together. We were both the members of a weird breakfast club. The breakfast doors closed at 6:50 in the morning. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of us on the second floor of Berman Hall would go down to the lobby, wait until the clock clicked over to 6:49, open the door, run across the campus, and we were the last ones. That's Dr. Richard Schwartz. Okay. A dear friend of mine who just passed away very recently, by the way. Yes, my good friend Dick Schwartz came to me at the very time, and he had the use of those records for writing
Light bearers.
Light bearers.
message. No, there's a
Light bearers to the remnant was the
Right,
original.
light bearers to the remnant. Yes, that's it. Yeah. Okay. That was one of the nice things about what happened.
But and just to follow up, that the access was that there were the separate vaults, and so there was, as far as I can judge from documents I've looked at, it would even be difficult for someone from Secretariat to go into the Treasury
Well, they
vault,
would, yeah, absolutely.
or vice versa, and that was part of the issue, to create a centralized records management. So even it wasn't just Adventist historians who had a hard time; even people within the building could conceivably have a hard time.
If there was a study committee, there was no way of knowing what was there.
Dr. Phillips.
Yeah, quite an interesting discussion. I'm wondering about how far back did the records go and what condition they were, because it would seem to me that they were not in any weather control area, and there'd be no kind of preparation, archaeological preparation for these papers.
The records went all the way back to 1863. Thin, very thin stream, of course. I can't remember when the correspondence started. Are you all familiar with correspondence books of the 1880s and 1890s? If you don't know about that, that's a fascinating little aspect of office history. I don't remember coming across any papers that were disintegrating or that had any problem. And part of the reason probably was that the materials had always been kept at a constant temperature by accident. That is, they were in a vault in the lower floor, and the temperature and humidity had no occasion to change. And it's the changes in humidity and temperature that hurt paper, not what the temperature is necessarily. And I don't know, these old materials didn't have acid in the paper like the ones in the...
No, quite often it was the thinner paper as well. And just from, not going back that far, but just from what I see in the vault myself from day to day, the correspondence is actually in quite good shape. It won't be forever, but I mean, it's still in very, very usable shape, very recognizable, yes.
But things that were in bad shape were the photographs.
Mm.
The
Yes.
photographs have, and that's one reason we put them up, is it stretches them out. It means many of the photographs you see now were rolled up or folded, and in some cases photographs fell apart along the crease lines. So photographs, there definitely has been some loss in. But I would speculate that maybe if culls had been done in the past, the documents may have deteriorated and been got rid of. One would be speculating. So.
I don't know. May I just say
Yes,
something
yes.
about photographs? And I don't know what method you and Benjamin did with the pictures, but if you ever are concerned about or finding some family treasures, photographs that are rolled up or in bad shape, I presume you know how to humidify them. Get a garbage can, put water in the bottom of it, put in some kind of a little riser, something that lifts up above the water, put the rolled up photograph and leave it there for 2 or 3 days. When you take it out, you can just open it up, pressure-type fine. I don't know whether you folks did that or not, but
We gave it to a company to do. I have to say. We could have saved the money. Peter, you want to talk
Well,
about
I
this?
just wanted to say, because of the question of the condition of records, the records that I have the most fear of losing, that we actually have, are the records that are stored on magnetic media, videotape, reel-to-reel audio tape, cassette audio tape, and that sort of material that really degrades much more quickly than paper, and so that's an area where there could be a loss of information. But the paper is actually in remarkably good shape.
would you say the film would run there too? 35
Film,
millimeter?
yeah, that would be similar. Although the magnetic media just disintegrates more quickly.
We'll only have time for one more question, then we'll move to the break. Evan.
This is another question for Dr. Yost. When you were describing the initial design of the classification system and the organization, you emphasized provenance as sort of the supreme guiding principle. I'm curious to know, was the nature of the records that you inherited such that establishing that provenance was relatively straightforward? And if not, what materials were most problematic?
The first answer to your first question is it was easy. Because they had been brought down from the office just the way they were. And it was easy to determine what office or what person created them, or if it was correspondence, for example, or minutes. I can't remember that we had any material that was all messed up, all mingled and so on. But
Can I?
I can't think of that as being a problem. It was,
But if I can follow up on that, one of the interesting issues we have faced in doing some research is finding things from what you might call stray committees. And so even though the office, it has on it, it's this committee, but who created this committee, what record group should we place it in? And I think those kinds of provenance questions you must have had difficulty with as well.
sure, and the same committee minutes will occur in several places because each member of the committee would have a copy.
Yes.
And we settled, I don't know whether you're still using this system or not, but I think it's record group 25, I don't know why that comes to my mind.
That's a committee minutes, yes.
25?
Yes.
I think having demonstrated that he's still master of the archive, that's a good point actually to move to our break. Oh no, we're right. One more.
Yeah, I'm just
Okay.
gonna say that one thing I didn't mention that I could mention, well, let me finish on that. We created record group 25, which was in the secretariat area, I think, for committee minutes, no matter what they were, unless they were particularly tied to a department. But in general, the miscellaneous committees would, and I don't know whether it just was alphabetical or,
Yes.
yeah, okay. The one other thing I wanted to mention about a concept in archival administration. I traveled some also, as the others have done, and I remember visiting a local field in the East Indonesia Union. Beautiful island territory. And they knew, of course, that I was coming, and they knew why I was coming and what I was there for. And they proudly showed me a room in the office building that they had all of their records in under lock and key. And so they opened the door and showed me what it was, and I don't remember exactly, but I could have said to them, well, what's in this box? And they would say, well, we don't know for sure, or, you know, whatever. And that just emphasized to me this principle, that you can have physical control of records, which they did. They were in a safe place under lock and key, but they did not have intellectual control. So those intellectual control is not the same as physical control.